Thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm trying to, in 15 minutes maybe, just tell a story. It won't be so much as a formal speech, but just reflections on Estonia, what happened 25 or 6 years ago, and where are we now. As you know, we also have this rotating presidency of the EU currently, and there are a lot of priorities, but certainly I can state that financing research and development and getting more money into the EU budgets is certainly one thing which we want to highlight, not necessarily achieve, because the budget discussions will start, I think, next year. But it is important to highlight this aspect. Well, people often say that, and I as an Estonian often say that we live in a digital society. And I think it needs to be explained what it really means, because with all those kind of catchwords, phrases, there are different meanings to it. And a very good example to that is when we speak when we speak about e-voting or electronic voting. Here in the States, it basically means that a voter goes to the booth and touches a touch screen, which is unsecure and could be easily hacked. In Estonia, e-voting basically means that you have a crypto communication with a voting commission, and you can do it not in the booth, not in the polling station, but from home, from your iPad, from your iPhone, regardless where you are in the world. And I think that illustrates as well that there needs to be some kind of explanation to do what we mean by digital society, what it really entails. And I think the best way is to just tell a short story how we got there. Well, if you fly back in time 25 or 6 years ago, in early 90s, there was nothing there in Estonia when we regained our independence. We've been occupied by the Soviets for 50 years, and I can assure you that their technology wasn't too advanced. So there wasn't really nothing to inherit. And I think that that was the sort of unique moment in time with different factors. That first, there was this rather plain field. There was nothing there which was usable, combined with an extreme enthusiasm of late 20-year-olds, early 30-year-olds who wanted to basically reinvent their country. Reinvent the country in an advanced technological way, and the best thing they came up with was basically two things. First, to invest as much as they could into the modern technology of the mid-90s, drawing optical fiber cables around the country, etc., etc. And second thing, open the world of knowledge up to the Estonian population. What it really means in combination was the open up World Wide Web to all the population. In practical terms, it meant that we created public access internet points. All the schools were in 2 or 3 years almost had the internet access, and that consequently, was so exciting for the kids, for the population. They actually started to use the knowledge, what was out there. It was new, it was, never had been done, at least for us. And at the same time, we introduced in our public schooling system something which is, called programming, and the idea based on that is very simple. The computer language we consider to be as any other foreign language, and we start to teach that from the early grades, as we start to teach English, French, or German from the very early grades, and see and believe that it might be useful for the young generation. Today, of course, 2 generations after, you can find internet as everywhere else, everywhere in the United States or Europe, internet access almost 100% available, and that's not a big story. I mean, this is not big news. But what happened with us was basically 2 things. The first generation of those, let's say, internet boomers started to enter into the private business and into the public business. And in the private business in late 90s, in the banking sector, in the services sector, almost 97% of the banking transactions were made by either mobile phone or by the computer. That was 17 years ago, which means that we skipped the checkbook sort of phase in banking, and never introduced that to ourselves. And of course, the private services have continued to grow, but I'd like to focus more on the public sector, and I think that relates very much to research and development nowadays as well. With this kind of enthusiasm and boom, the government, the public officials introduced e-governance or e-government, which basically meant that the government went paperless in 2000, 17 years ago. And the effect of that was maybe twofold. Of course, it was more efficient because you didn't need to coordinate all your positions with different departments, agencies, etc., pushing papers. You could do it easily. The length of the cabinet meetings dropped twice, as it was happened to be, etc., etc. And it became also more transparent. Transparent in a very practical way. You could log into the government or Ministry of Finance and see how every euro or every cent was spent from the public from the government budget. So there was such kind of element of accountability. And I think this was still, sort of the first step, because one can ask, the private citizen or the private person can ask, okay, the government is paperless, so what? What's in it for me? I mean, I have my own business, I don't care how the government works, and the less government, of course, the better. But what's going to happen next? And I think there's the uniqueness. I think what we came up with. I mean, the trick was really how to connect each and every citizen with the state, technologically, but more importantly, politically and psychologically. How to create a device which actually provides enough trust that the people could then start to use it. Not being afraid that there is a big brother, or not being afraid that the personal data of every and each individual is somehow misused. And I think that was the crucial idea, because technology itself is good but not enough. You have to change the mindset, and you have to change the sort of the societal cause, if you wish, to achieve things. We came up with a very simple solution with a sort of plastic ID card with the chip there. And what the chip really does is it allows you to have encrypted communication between the state and the individual, or between the individuals. You can actually have a encrypted email exchange as well through that. But more importantly, and this is above, on top of the technology, I think what created really the trust was the legal provision that the personal data of each individual is the private property of that individual. So basically, we excluded the situation where the government owns any personal data on us. We are the owners. We can deal with our personal data as with any personal belonging. We have the right and the ability to check how the government actually accesses our data, why, when, and how. And I think this combination of the technology and sort of legal provisions created the situation now that we can do probably almost anything, with the exception of marriage and divorce electronically, and not entering the office. There is an argument, the taxis, the all kind of vehicle registrations, etc., which usually takes quite some time. And the taxis, of course, are a very good example here in the States, because it takes me something between 3-5 minutes to file my taxes annually. Although I have to say that we have a different tax system than in the US. We have a flat tax, or flat income tax, for individuals as for their corporate income. So it makes things easier, certainly. But I think still that this kind of twofold innovation, not only on the sort of technological side, but also being innovative in legislature, the combination of how to actually use the technology, not for sort of from the government points of view, not for profit, but for common good, is important element in our kind of success, which we are quite proud of. I think we have to think how to go further and not to stop on what we have achieved. I'm very glad that we have here one company from Estonia, the Starship, which produces those kind of delivery robots. They are operational near the Pond Circle. I visited them. I visited them in Silicon Valley a couple of weeks ago, and they are very effective. They are in Tallinn as well, in my capital, but really now we start to think how to integrate them to our society. And I read in the news, for example, that 2 days ago there was a collision on a street by a car and the robot. According to Estonian traffic rules, this incident was classified, the car was in violation of traffic rules because the robot had a right to go and the car didn't stop. I don't know how it is regulated here in the States or in different states or in other places or in other countries where those robots like Starship or any other will operate, or drones. I think someone said that this is quite the situation which we faced really, let's say 100 years ago when the cars were introduced on the streets. How to regulate that. But this is important, and I think there's an excellent quote from the Germans, from the German Federal Ministry of Transportation, which basically asks the fundamental question which is important for all kind of innovators and researchers to answer. And at the fundamental level, it all comes down to a following question: how much dependence on technologically complex systems, which in the future will be based on artificial intelligence and possibly with machine learning capabilities like this one, are we willing to accept in order to achieve in return more safety, more mobility, and more comfort? And I think here, is the next stage of innovation, the next stage of research. Those things, or the Internet of Things, is inevitable. Smart people like you are creating those solutions every day. And we as government, and me as a government rep, have to think creatively. Oops, that's my timer. And I've spoken now for 15 minutes and I'm almost done. Is how we're going to solve those issues of interaction between machines, artificial intelligence, and people. And therefore, for example, as I started with the EU presidency, I will conclude, we will have next week in Tallinn the digital summit of the EU, which means that the Merkels, Macrons, and Mays of Europe will all gather in Tallinn to tackle those issues. We are quite convinced actually that we won't solve them, but at least we see our role as putting those questions on the table and start the discussion which in coming years hopefully will come to results. And I'd like just to end with two notes. First, that you have the sort of pivotal role in that. And I think it's always important to remember that technology by itself is a nice thing to have, but somehow it has to improve our way of life, if you wish. And finally, thank you very much. I'd like to introduce also David. David is the man behind those machines here in Washington, D.C., and he will explain what yet another wonderful Estonian innovation is all about.
Thank you, Ambassador.